Committee of Infrastructure and the Planning and Economic Development Committee on October 24th, 2018 at 7 p.m. here in the chambers. Can the clerk please call the rolls of both committees?
Yes, I will. Alderman Lopez. Here. Alderman Schmidt. I'm here. Alderman Jetty. Here. And Alderman Gedge. Here. And of the PEDC, Marianne Malizagoya is coming in late as she has a previous meeting. And Alderman Jetty. Here. David Tenza, Alderman Laws, and myself. That's it.
The chair of the committee, myself.
Also, we have Chair of the Committee.
Michael O'Brien. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And we have
Also
President.
in attendance, can the clerk please record Alderman Dowd is also here as well. And Alderman Karen is here. Okay. And Alderman McCarthy. I'm letting the clerk catch up. It's like, I've been clerk, it's a tough job.
Yeah.
To look up and
Thank
everything.
you for your help.
No
I appreciate it.
All right, very good. Are we all set?
We are all set.
Okay, communications.
From Tim Cummings, Director, Economic Development Division, East Hollis Street, Bridge Street improvements, proposed preferred alternative.
There being no objection, I would like to suspend the rules and accept and place on file a communication received after the agenda was prepared from Director Cummings. Further communications.
Communication from James and Mary Cutter, subject 88 Palm Street.
There again being no objection, I would like to suspend the rules and accept and place on file a communication received after the agenda was prepared by Mr. James and Mary Cutter. At this particular point, we're going to have a presentation on the East Hollis Bridge Street Transportation Improvement Project, and I'd like to have Julie and come forward, and everybody, yes, come on up. No, you may come up and sit right in the seats, and we're all set and ready for you. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Julie Chismus. I'm the Transportation and Long Range Planner with the Department, with the Community Development Division here at the City of Nashua. I've been working closely with Tim Cummings, who is the city's project manager on the East Hollis Street, Bridge Street traffic improvements. And we are here this evening to share with you the results of an engineering study completed by McFarland Johnson and also with the assistance of CRJA Landscape Architects. With me this evening are Brian Coburn, project manager, senior project engineer with McFarland Johnson, Brian Patinskis, also with McFarland Johnson, and Jonathan Law with CRJA Landscape Architects. And so without further ado, I will let them get on with the presentation and share with you what we learned during this engineering study. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, Mr. Coburn.
Yes, thank you. Again, Brian Colburn with McFarland Johnson. Brief presentation with the goal of just explaining when we started this process back in March of defining the preferred alternative to improve the intersection of East Hall Street and Bridge Street, how the steps we took and the information we learned to come to a preferred alternative. Again, just a brief agenda of the steps we'll go through, starting with a brief project overview, going through some of the public outreach efforts we've undertaken and how we determined the preferred alternative. So this is our study area for the intersection. It's outlined in red, the red line here. Basically extends along Bridge Street and East Hall Street from the intersections with C Street to the river. Those limits of the project were set when the city applied for a grant from the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. This project is being funded through that grant. It's got a $2.8 million construction budget right now. 80% of that money is coming from the Federal Highway Administration, FHWA. The 20% local match is being covered for this project by Turnpike toll credits. So currently there is no city money programmed for this project. To assist us in determining a preferred alternative, we did form a steering committee to act as a conduit for stakeholders in the area, help us test our alternatives out and build a consensus. So when we went to the public, we had a pretty good idea of what would be accepted and what wouldn't. They helped us form our project's goals and vision. And this is a list of our committee members, made up of city staff. Alderwoman McCarron was on the committee as well. A few local business owners, including one that was a direct abutter. And we did involve the town of Hudson in our work as well. Again, just to frame our project, we set out some goals early on. These were somewhat established by, again, the grant application that was submitted. Project is to address all modes of transportation, so this is not specifically geared just to vehicles using the area, but we were looking at pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users as well. We know this is a busy intersection. We're trying to do a lot of different things to improve the area, but we did have a goal of not making the traffic conditions any worse than they are today. We also recognize that this is a regional roadway. A lot of people use this, the bridge to cross the river here from Hudson and towns to the east to get to the turnpike. Some may say there's too much traffic coming through this area for it to handle. That is not within the scope of this project. We are just looking at the intersection and not trying to solve any of those larger regional transportation issues. And we do recognize that there has been previous work done on this corridor. There's a East Hall Street master plan document and another study that was done in 2015. We didn't want to redo any of that, so we kind of use that as our starting point, is looking at the work that had been done before we were involved and then building upon that. Just a little bit about the steps that are involved when you use this federal money with New Hampshire DOT administering it. It's a 4-step process. We are currently in step 1, which is called the engineering study. The purpose of this is to identify a preferred alternative, which is what we're here for tonight, to get consensus on that. The following steps are preliminary and final design. Those will take us to about later in 2019 or very early in 2020 to complete. And then the 4th step is actually construction, which again would be targeting mostly completed in 2020 for this project. Zooming in on what we do as part of the engineering study, we conduct a field survey. We look at all of the resources in the area. We consult with the state historian, archaeologists, look for natural wetlands. Obviously we have the river right adjacent to us. We also look at, is there a hazardous site in the area, and try to get a good sense of what our constraints will be. What are the things that could potentially be impacted by the project? We go through an alternatives development process involving the public in our decision making as well. For the public involvement, we did have a fairly robust program for this project. In addition to meeting with the steering committee, I believe we met with them 5 times through the course of this project. We also had a public listening session that was early on in the process, and what that is make sure that we have a good understanding of all of the issues that abutters and people that use this intersection experience every day, that we understand all that before we even start our work. So that listening session occurred very early on in the process. After we had developed some alternatives, we had a public workshop where we presented all 3 and received pros and cons from the public, and that helped us in selecting the preferred alternative. This meeting here concludes our public outreach effort for this phase. We'll probably have some more meetings through the design phase to flesh out some of the details. But this meeting is kind of culminates as the governing body's consensus with the group that we've selected the right preferred alternative. In addition to meetings, we have had a project website, NashuaGatewayProject.com, that's been active throughout the project. We've been posting information on social media as well. So probably not surprising to most people that use the intersection, this is what we heard at the listening session early on in the project. You know, there's some safety issues both with vehicles and some of the merging and speed issues that are occurring. The lack of pedestrian and bicycle facilities making it not as safe as it could be for them to traverse the area. We heard a lot about traffic and how there's a lot of traffic. But did get a good sense of how especially the Riverside Landing project has increased some cut-through traffic on D Street. So heard from those residents. You know, it's cutting through the neighborhood, and also, you know, how difficult it is to make some of the left turns out of the C, D, and E Street areas. We also touched on access. Obviously, right now, it's getting in and out of Riverside Landing isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. Some of the movements are restricted, and you have to use those side streets to make some of them. And also to the south of the project, the Crown Street area. It's an area that's been identified by the city as you know, room for a potential redevelopment or improvement, but it's tough to get in and out of that area. The city just constructed the park and ride at 25 Crown Street with the thought that potentially that could be a rail station in the future. So again, facilitating access to that area. We also heard about an interest in gaining more access to the river by pedestrians, being able to get down to the top of the levee and access the path that's down there, having something better defined. In terms of aesthetics, we did hear about how it's not the most aesthetically pleasing gateway into the city, but we also heard from the local neighborhood some of their concerns about, you know, they felt they've lost some amenities over the past few years as some of those other projects have gone through. A skate park was relocated. I know some trees were cut for the Riverside Landing. So we did hear from them that, you know, they see this project as a way for them to improve aesthetics of their neighborhood as well. So doing that in addition to the intersection improvement. Again, Riverwalk had some interesting ideas about a community garden and dog park and things of that nature as well.
Excuse me, Mr. Coburn, if I may.
Yep.
Mr. Coburn and I discussed at the beginning of the meeting, felt that it would be best, well, he has the tile up, and the subject is fresh and hot. If there's any committee members that do have question, please be recognized, and I will allow it at that particular time, so he can explain while he's on that particular subject. Thank you, Mr. Coburn.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I'd forgotten to say that. So we take all that information and develop a purpose and needs statement. Really, what that is it's a bar that we then measure our alternatives against. You know, so our purpose and need was to improve mobility through the area, not only for vehicles, but for pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit, as well as improving the aesthetics. Again, that statement was what we were measuring our alternatives against. So again, purpose, improve mobility, improve access, and that access ties in with facilitating adjacent land use. Again, not adversely impacting traffic, and then providing an aesthetically pleasing gateway. And that one, again, even ties into adding some amenities for the neighborhood. The need for the project has been identified as there's daily traffic congestion, a lack of bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. Merging vehicles create a safety issue in addition to some of the speeds that are occurring out there. There's limited access to the Crown Street and Riverside Landing developments. And again, it's not a very pleasing gateway to the city. So just to touch on some of the previous studies, this is a matrix that the 2015 study that was done by another consultant prepared, and they looked at a a wide range of alternatives, from just more or less keeping what's out there. They looked at different signalized intersection operations. They looked at turning the roads in the area to one way, making making Bridge Street one way, and then making East Hollis one way in the opposite direction to make sort of a larger loop. Most of those were dismissed as part of that study. One of the options, a roundabout, was, I guess, somewhat accepted and then later was dismissed. And so there's a little bit of confusion about would it work. So one of the first things we did was we conducted new traffic counts and modeled how a roundabout would operate at this location, and found that it would not operate very well. To summarize it, traffic's coming from a lot of different directions, and in a roundabout, really a heavy movement can dominate a roundabout situation because there's only yield signs creating gaps. And so if you want to control and make sure everybody's equal share, you really need a traffic light to dictate that to them. If there's a lot of situations where roundabouts work because the traffic flow, one movement creates gaps for the next leg, so that leg can get on, which can create gaps for the next leg. Here, with such heavy movements coming in and out of Hudson, certain movements would just dominate the situation. Most notably, traffic coming out of Hudson would virtually have nobody opposing them. So nobody would be, very little people would be coming around to make a left, say, into Riverside Landing. So as that, especially in the morning, as that flow of traffic is pouring out of Hudson, heading to East Hollis Street, the people on Bridge Street would basically have no chance to get out. So the model showed that that queue of traffic got very much longer than it is today. So for those reasons, and not meeting the don't make traffic work worse bar that we had set, the roundabouts were dismissed and were not carried forward as a part of this study. So what we did determine is we really need a traffic signal to control the traffic. So the first alternative we looked at really is just looking at the way it operates today and making enhancements for pedestrian and bicycle facilities. So as I go through these alternatives, I'm going to show 4 slides for each one. So the first one is more or less an engineering plan view. This is what this project would construct. I will show, the following slide will show what a connection to Crown Street would look like. Now, this project is not going to build that connection, but as we had identified access as one of the goals, we wanted to make sure that what was being built could accommodate a connection to Crown Street should the city decide to make that in the future. Following slides will show what landscape opportunities there are for each alternative. So we'll show the first one will be what this project can afford to construct and what is eligible through the funding source we have. The second slide is a more robust landscaping, streetscaping plan. It shows you the potential that each alternative presents. So there'll be things that are shown such as a kid play park, community garden. Those won't be constructed as part of this project, and they don't necessarily have to be that specific use. We just wanted to show and demonstrate what potential is involved in each alternative. And Jonathan from our landscape architect will go through those 2 slides in detail. So again, this is this alternative 1. Traffic operates the same as it does today. We've added bike lanes along all of the movements, and we've also added sidewalk along each of the legs as well. So a point I want, yep.
So this plan doesn't change travel lanes at all, right? It changes pedestrian and bike amenities solely and some landscaping.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, that's correct.
Further, Alderman Dow?
Yeah, and this alternative wouldn't affect the traffic backup at all either.
Correct. So I do want to point out, as we go through this, that if the sole goal of this project were to move traffic, then this would probably be the preferred alternative, because the situation that's out there today processes the traffic most efficiently. That's there. Now, and the main thing is, if you can see my mouse here, it's just kind of jumpy, but right now from Bridge Street, coming from Hudson, continuing on Bridge Street, through this intersection, there's no traffic light. So those people flow freely. They do have to stop at the signal at D Street, which doesn't have a lot of demand right now. But for the most part, they have a free movement. Similarly, heading into Hudson on East Hollis Street, that movement has no light through this area. So again, for this intersection, this option processes the most amount of traffic. However, when you look at the potential to add a Crown Street connection, all we can offer, or all this alternative can offer, is really a right-in, right-out drive, similar to the driveway that's currently going to Riverfront Landing. People who want to head back to the city or coming from Hudson that want to get into the Crown Street area would have to do, the movements that they're doing today, either Alds or Arlington Street, which are signalized, and those signals are pretty much at capacity now. So this did not score very high on the improved access. Jonathan will touch on a little bit as we get into the next slide, but as you go through these, just see that, how the green spaces is provided. This does provide a fair amount of green space through the intersection area, but it's divided into 4 quadrants. And really these middle pieces, it's really jumpy. Well, the 2 kind of middle triangles of green space, are really difficult to access under this alternative. We don't have a pointer.
Good evening. I'm Jonathan Law with Carroll Johnson Associates. We're landscape architects, and we've been part of this team from the initial stages of the project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape design now. So we're going to have 2 slides for each one. The first slide will be what we're calling the basic design, which is basically, in layman terms, what the project can pay for. And then the second slide, as Brian mentioned earlier, will show what the vision for this area could be, which would mean some money input by the city. The criteria for the full build-out, let's call it, is based on the steering committee meeting feedback that we received. So, for example, as Brian earlier mentioned, people talked about dog parks, playgrounds, community gardens, connections to the river, and just gateway element, and more open green space for people in the surrounding neighborhoods to enjoy. So this first slide, you'll see that there are new sidewalks through some open green spaces in the larger central islands. The 2 islands to the north and the south are just grassed islands with some street trees. In this option, we have 62 shade trees, and they're dotted along the roadways and then also in the central areas. Now, street trees perform a few important elements in terms of streetscape design. What we're trying to do is, what they do, street trees, is they help to slow down traffic. There's studies being undertaken that show that street trees help to slow down traffic, which is what we'd like to do in certain parts of this site. Also, you'll notice that there are 2 existing buildings that are going to remain, and as I mentioned before, there's kind of a loop pedestrian sidewalk loop that goes from the western green space into the eastern green space, and then there's a connection down to the river. Go to the next slide. So this is the full build-out slide of what you could get if this was a master plan with money input from the city. So here you'll see on the western island, or we'll call that the western island closest to East Street, is a community garden. So that's a place where residents or local people can have a plot and plant vegetables, flowers, things like that. Adjacent to that, and again, this would service the local neighborhood, is a children's playground. There's a flagpole, which again is in that western island. And then we've obviously significantly greened it up with more planting, street trees. We've also graded areas, so when you're within the community garden and the playground, if we berm those areas up and heavily plant them, you won't realize that there's a pretty significant vehicular traffic route going by you. So you'll be enjoying a pedestrian space and not feel as though you're surrounded by vehicular traffic movements in all directions. Then if we go to the western island, western portion, we have another pedestrian loop that again is heavily planted. And the idea of that is it's, again, open green space / dog park, which is another thing that people mentioned that they were interested in. But I think you can notice, so one other thing, that we did some preliminary costing of this effort, and the city dollar amount to produce something like this would be roughly $620,000.
I do have a question, and it would be, with the community garden and the playground, I imagine some people are gonna take their cars to that location to, enjoy their visit. So the parking would be on East Street itself, then? There's no designated parking area with this?
Correct.
Okay.
And we also, because the feedback we received was important spaces for people to enjoy, we didn't want to take those spaces up by providing additional parking.
Okay.
We spoke to local neighborhood and they said there's, people can park on those streets and it shouldn't be an issue.
That's it?
Yep.
All right, Brian Colburn again. I'll just highlight the decision matrix here. We'll start to go through that we left on everybody's desk. Get into it a little bit more later, but I did want to point out a few things as you start to look at it. The traffic operations level of service, you'll see letters there. That's how we grade in engineering how traffic performs. It's a lot like school. A is really good traffic with virtually no delay, and F is you're starting to experience delay you cannot tolerate anymore. So I did want to point out that. And then it just kind of highlights some of the major points we've identified for each alternative as it relates to mobility, access, traffic, aesthetics, and what it can offer the neighborhood. Again, this is a rendering that was done of what a little park and community garden could look. East Street is in the background, and East Hall Street's on your left. So it's kind of looking from the middle of the intersection back into the city. So as I said before, these were presented at a public meeting back in August. And what we heard was some pros for this alternative is, obviously it's a familiar traffic pattern, so people won't be getting confused. Impacts during construction wouldn't be too significant, as we would mostly be just widening the road a little to provide space for bicyclists and then reconstructing the sidewalks. Some cons we heard are why spend any money if the intersection isn't going to change. This option doesn't do anything to improve the emerging traffic situation on East Hall Street coming into the city. And D Street, we can see, continue to see cut-through traffic as that's the only way people can get in to Riverside Landing coming from East Hall Street.
Question?
Yeah, looking at the alternatives and the cost, with no change to the footprint, how does this alternative work out to be $2.3 million? Is that because we're rebuilding all the road that is existing there?
Yes, we did assume we would, whatever road we touched, we would fully reconstruct.
Okay.
And try to leverage as much of federal and state money as we can to make the roads as best as we can. So that's consistent through the three.
Another, Alderman Dow?
Two questions. One, in any of these alternatives, and particularly in one, did we look at widening Hollis and Bridge Streets? And if we did, I know the biggest part of the problem with congestion is you're taking traffic going out of Nashua in the evening, and it gets bogged down in Hudson. Is Hudson thinking about doing anything to improve it on their side?
So just last year, Hudson implemented for lack of a better term, smarter traffic signal system for their triangle area of signals. So they've really optimized that as best they can without doing significant work. So there's nothing in any planning stage right now to improve Hudson beyond what they have today. To answer your questions about widening the roadways, we did look at possibly widening Bridge Street to have 2 lanes heading into Hudson to try to cut that queue down and get more people through the light. The concern we have with that is right now, as you get onto the bridge, you have 1 lane from East Hollis and you have 1 lane from Bridge Street, and there's still a fair amount of mixing of traffic that happens. If we had 2 lanes coming from Bridge Street, we'd really have to make East Hall Street yield to them in that situation, because you wouldn't want them darting across 2 lanes of traffic to get into because a lot of people want to be in the left lane as they head into Hudson. So for that reason, we dismissed widening Bridge Street to 2 lanes. We didn't look extensively at widening East Hall Street to have 2 lanes, extending the 2 lanes into the city, just because the right-of-way impacts were going to be significant at that point.
Follow up. Right now, the way that it's configured, right where that traffic light is on the crisscross, when East Hollis and Bridge Street merge to go across Ferry Street, people coming up East Hollis Street that want to go left when they go into Hudson try to merge left right there, and vice versa on the Bridge Street. They want to take a right to go in South Hudson. So it's a crisscross, and that's a nightmare. So somehow we should be looking at fixing that some way.
Noted. That is a problem. So we did start to look at some different alternatives. So alternative 2 came about. This started really with the roundabout idea, but when we realized that wasn't work, we kind of kept a circular traffic pattern and just put signals at every corner. So that's how traffic would operate here. The mouse does seem to be working better. So I'm going to try to, can you see the pointer? I'll try to trace some movements just so it's clear. So if you're on Bridge Street, where'd it go? Right here. If you're on Bridge Street wanting to head to Ferry Street into Hudson, you would come through this traffic signal, take a left at another traffic signal, and then continue on. If you're on Bridge Street coming in, there would be a traffic signal here to let Riverside Landing come in. You could either continue straight on Bridge Street, take a left, again, another traffic light, and then come in down East Hall Street. what this does is it gives pretty much full access to Riverfront Landing. So you wouldn't need a signal at D Street anymore because now you could either take the right and access Bridge Street or this way to East Hall Street, and even gives you now that left-hand movement going through 3 traffic signals to head out on Ferry Street. Also coming from East Hall Street heading into Riverfront Landing, you would have a light here, but then you'd be able to take this little road, new road here, and access it that way. So it does improve on the access aspect. Does add some lanes because now we're stopping traffic. For instance, here, the people that were on Bridge Street that used to go straight through, they have to stop at this light now. People on East Hall Street that used to stay straight through, they have to stop at a light now. So those 2 movements, as you'll see in the decision matrix, those particular movements, levels of service, are decreased because they were free-flowing before. Now we've made them stop. Granted, we've tried to keep those cycle lengths, the traffic lights as short as we can, and they would be coordinated. So, if you're on Bridge Street here heading out of the city, this would be green at the same time, and this would be green. So it's not like you get stuck one light to the next. But it does add delay to their trip. It decreases delay for some other trips. So right now, if you're coming out of Riverfront Landing, you're at the mercy basically of somebody letting you in. Now you have your own lights, so their levels of service get a lot better. Yep.
Okay. I do have a question on the lighting, and you said smart lighting that Hudson has improved to. Is that going to be a facsimile or something like that where we're going to get the optimum, and is that going to be included in this project where probably like a computer enhanced system, they'll talk to each other, can be adjusted for peak flows, times, and everything else?
Yes.
Correct? Yeah.
Yep. This will be state of the art.
Can I do a follow-up as well, too?
Sure.
In the E Street cutover from, as you come from Bridge Street to cut over to East Hollis Street there, I noticed 2 lanes, and to me, does it have to be 2 lanes to go back over to Ferry Street? That's usually for people who make a mistake, am I correct? Nobody's gonna cross the bridge to go back over, right? So the majority of the traffic, would they not take that cut-through to get onto East Hollis Street?
You're talking about this section here?
That section there.
Why is it so wide? So even though these will be smart, there's the potential some people may jump the yellow through this first signal and then get stuck in here.
Right.
There's also would be people coming out of Riverfront Landing that, they're not going to get a nice green
Gotcha.
cycle to
Okay,
get through,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So if they're going into Hudson, they're probably going to get stopped here. So if this were only 2 lanes through here,
Mm-hmm.
and you get 10 or 15 cars stuck at that light,
Yeah.
now they've blocked everybody that wants to make
Gotcha.
the bridge to East Hollis movement. So that's why it's four lanes. That is a good question. So an interesting aspect of this alternative is when you add Crown Street connection into the equation, it adds a whole nother light. So now you're up to 4 lights for this alternative. Again, traffic model shows things working okay. This doesn't make traffic worse. So the way we measured that is just looking at the back of Q, so the back of the stacked up traffic during the peak hour, and this would produce similar Q lengths as to what exists today. So we wouldn't be backing up traffic into Hudson as part of this. We wouldn't be backing up traffic more on Bridge Street than is what already is occurring.
Follow up on the future Crown Street connection. Today does exist, if you look down closer to the levee, and it is a roundabout way, but that is still Crown Street, I'm assuming. And it comes out, so it could go to the most western light, and you could put a lane there and you'll receive the same advantage, correct?
Well, that would be a really tough right-hand turn coming out because you'd be basically heading due west and have to throw a U-turn to get headed in the right direction on the traffic.
Because the existing property that's there, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So in terms of landscape for this option, one thing that jumps out is that the green space closest to the adjacent neighborhood is very small. So that creates some issue. Sorry, Jonathan Law again. It creates some problematic issues there with it being a small, thin space. It can't really be programmed that well. What the basic option provides are some street trees, lawn areas, and that's about it. The city, for this option, would have to contribute around $80,000 to get this basic option, because the reason that is to construct all this roadway takes more of the initial budget than you saw in the previous version. So even to get this very basic 30 shade trees and the lawn areas would still require some monies from the city. If we go to the full build, again, we're keeping the same attributes, the park, the dog park, the children's play area. You'll notice that we have the community garden that's closest to East Street, and then we have a smaller tot lot. But again, as I mentioned before, the issues with that is that because the space is so restricted there, we had to have the children's play area in the middle section. Now, if someone goes down there with two children, one's a smaller child and then one's of older age, then there's some separation. So again, it's not ideal. But we still have the same, as I mentioned, the same attributes. We've got, some open green space that is significantly screened from the major vehicular arteries. We have the dog park and open green space on the western section. But again, it's just a rather broken up design in terms of pedestrian connections and pedestrian movements in this area. And the next slide you'll see is a rendering if we're basically hovering over East Street, looking at the new roadway to the east. And so this is the small tot lot and then the community garden.
If we can go back one slide, my question would be, the number 3, that is listed is a sewer intercept building with the city. I know it's not the optimum topography because it goes down into a hill. But however, did you give any consideration for the park at that location and maybe to have parking where it's a larger area? Again, with the buildup of the trees to isolate so you're not getting into the noise. Did you consider that large area there?
Yeah, but we heard from the local community, and they were more in favor of providing amenities that they could walk to, or that are closer to the neighborhood. So if someone's on C Street, they can still walk to the areas that are closer. If we move it across to the western side, then not only is that a further pedestrian movement for them to make, but we're also asking them to cross, excuse me, 2 fairly major roadways.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going with young children, that's obviously a concern to parents. So that's the reason why we try to keep the things that involve children much closer to the neighborhood.
Okay.
And Bri Colburn again.
Alderman Dowd has a question for me.
And on all of these alternatives, I may have missed it, did you do a full traffic study analysis?
Yes.
Okay, so, because it just seems to me if we start putting in pedestrian crosswalks that have a button to stop traffic, it's gonna slow things down. Is that taken into account when you're grading the traffic flow?
Yes, I mean, the letters we're presenting here is for a cycle when no pedestrian phase is pushed, so the button isn't pushed. We could generate those numbers, but should point out, I believe there's a button there today. I don't think it's used very often, but there is a button there today. Cross those roads.
Because the largest number of concerns that I've received in phone calls about this entire intersection is morning and evening rush hour traffic. It's everybody feels it's impossible. So I was hoping that whatever we do to this intersection would fix that to some degree, as opposed to make it any worse. So, you know, I'm not as concerned about the landscaping and amenities, although it would be a nicer gateway into Nashua, but if we don't fix the traffic flow, you know, spending a lot of money and not getting the desired result from the taxpayers, so.
And I can address that when we get to how we rated the three alternatives together. So what we heard from alternative 2 is nobody seemed to like it. Didn't get any pros really mentioned at our public meeting for that option. Some cons where, you know, it needed 3 traffic lights and even needed a 4th in the future should a Crown Street connection happen. More delay for vehicles, and a lot of people found the layout to be confusing. They were concerned people weren't going to know how to get through the intersection.
Excuse me, Mr. Corbin, I'd like to welcome the Chairman of the Planning and Economic Development Committee, Alderman Militia Goja, at 1947. Welcome.
Thank you. And I apologize. I hope you got the message. I had a neighborhood meeting, neighborhood watch meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
No, you're here just in time for the third alternative.
Which I must say, I was at your Dr. Chris presentation, so I have seen some of this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good. So alternative 3 is actually one of the alternatives that was studied back in 2015. Uses two traffic signals to facilitate the movements. And again, we're keeping all of the traffic movements that are there today and adding full access for the riverfront landing. So this alternative you'd be able to eliminate the signal at D Street as well. So again, just to trace the movements, these are a little bit easier, but if you're on Bridge Street, I can get it here. It doesn't look like it's going to work, but if you're on Bridge Street heading to Hudson, you come up to the first light, you make a right, and then you make a left. Again, those signals would be coordinated. For Bridge Street heading into the city on East Hollis, you get in the left 2 lanes, and then you're into the right 2 lanes to make that movement. But again, when you compare this to what's happening today, the people that are on Bridge Street that want to stay on Bridge Street have a signal. They wouldn't have a signal at D Street, so that's somewhat not captured in the levels of service we've listed here. So we have eliminated a light for them and just kind of moved it over to the riverfront landing driveway. For East Hall Street heading into Hudson, again, that movement right now, no light. There would be a light for them under this scenario. We've mitigated that queue or the backup of traffic there by having 2 lanes going. So this is an option where we can now have 2 lanes on Bridge Street and 2 lanes on East Hollis that go into Hudson. So some of that getting in the right lane can occur kind of to the west of the intersection. So if you know you want to be in the left lane when you're headed into Hudson, you know, as you're coming down Bridge Street and we split into 2 lanes, you can select the left turn lane at that point and stay in that lane. Same if you're coming from East Hall Street, you know, as you split at that first light, you're going to be able to get in your assigned lane. And then when you go green, you know, you're not worried about any traffic coming in from Bridge Street and having to mix with them. So it does help that situation a little bit. Yep. Question?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about this one. I mean, first, it just seems like there's a tremendous amount of conflicting motion on the north-south segment because everybody wants to get to the other side of that from the one they're on. Are we sure that doesn't ever back up?
Yes, so in actually the Bridge Street to East Hall Street, they only have to go through this one light. So it's fairly similar to their movement today because they're only getting a signal to conflict with the Bridge Street traffic. So we've added the driveway traffic from Riverfront Landing, but we're not expecting that to be a lot.
I guess what
So-
I'd worry about is if, when the light to Hudson is red for traffic that came from Bridge Street, is the traffic going to back up across the lane so that the westbound traffic can't get through to East Hollis Street?
Yep, and that's why these two will be linked. So this one, when this goes red, this one will stay green a little bit longer to
Okay.
make sure those cars can clear out. This storage area is really only for the Riverfront Landing people who come out because they'll have to take it two steps to get across because they'll get a green here, but then they'll have to sit and wait their turn here. But for those major movements, they'll be coordinated so it flows right through.
The other question I had from looking at it is there enough right-of-way to make the storage lane for the left turn from East Hollis Street a dedicated left turn and still have two through lanes to, what I worry about is if you get one car stuck there because the north-south segment is backed up getting into Riverside Landing, it's going to close one of the lanes to Hudson, probably at the worst time of the day.
So you're talking about these two lanes here, and this one's shown
Yeah.
as a share. So they're phased. These lanes both go, and there's nobody that the person making a left would have to yield to. So a lot of traditional signals, if you have a green arrow and you want to make a left, you've got to wait.
Right.
For people
I
coming
guess
in.
I'm just wondering what happens how are the lights phased between there and the one at the top for the traffic getting into Riverfront Landing? Can that lane ever fill up?
Our model doesn't show it filling up.
Okay.
It is something we could explore. It's not so much a right-of-way issue right here. It's more the grade of Crown Street starts to drop off
Oh, okay.
as East Hall Street climbs up. We do have a median here, a raised median separating the two. To put that left turn lane in, we'd probably have to get rid of the median, and I think it's important to have that, especially down here, to make sure people aren't making an illegal left into East Street or people on East Street trying to dart out across traffic. This does have, as we go to a Crown Street connection scenario where basically everything would be set up. So all the city would have to build is really this roadway when the time came. But if development or the traffic on this road was more than we have anticipated now, it'd be fairly easy just to add another lane here at that time to make sure that any of that storage traffic wouldn't back up.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I, I am a regular traveler at between 7:50 and 8:05 in the morning from East Hollis Street into Hudson using Ferry Street and, going over. And I have to say that's probably one of the busiest times going over. And I never have a problem with traffic merging on Bridge Street, from Bridge Street. People seem to know how to do that. But my concern is, how is this light, the southern light for East Hollis Ferry Street, how is that going to be timed with the light in Hudson? Because I think that's a bigger issue, getting over there and the timing of the lights in Hudson. There are some mornings when I am backed up, almost back into Nashua on the bridge. And recently, most mornings, I'm off the bridge and halfway to the light before traffic stops. But that's my bigger concern, what's happening on the Hollis side for all of this, because I think that's going to impact what happens over here with congestion.
So as we continue design, we're gonna have to continue to coordinate with Hudson to make sure that, I'm not sure these signals will get physically linked, but I'm sure there are things that we can do that can sense what's coming from Hudson, you know, put a sensor in the pavement that if the queue is all the way over the bridge, then, you know, we would probably shut off the Bridge Street movement at that point, just because we wouldn't want to flood and jam up the middle of the intersection. We want to make sure we keep it free for people coming out of Hudson, or else the whole thing might go into gridlock. So there are going to be some sensors and detectors we need to put in to make sure that happens. I mean, we keep talking to Hudson. I mean, if we can get coordinated with them and synced up in part of their system, then there will be something we explore.
Okay, because if I may, Mr. Chairman, there are the 3 lights over there
Mhm.
in that triangular layout that Hudson, I have to say, has done some work on, so traffic flows much more smoothly now than it did 18 months ago.
Yep.
But I think it's going to be critical to have this tied in. And I know I've spoken to some people from Hudson, and they may even be watching this once it's aired. And they're very interested in what's going on. And as you know, people have come to the previous meetings
Yes. Yep.
from Hudson.
Yep.
And
The
they're
town
interested.
engineer. The town engineer from Hudson attended our public alternatives workshop, and he has been invited to all of our steering committee meetings and attended a few. Okay.
So in terms of landscape design, this is probably the preferred option, because what it does is creates 2 smaller parks, the 2 areas that are create 2 parks basically for the local neighborhood and people who want to go down there. You'll see in this basic option that we're getting 40 shade trees, some new lawn areas, flagpole, some pedestrian light fixtures, so that means people can use these walkways at nighttime, a couple of benches and some trash receptacles. So it's getting a fairly landscape treatment, and that would be 0 cost in dollars to the city. That this would come from the project itself. Then if we go to the full vision, the full build, again, you can see on the western side, we've got a pretty well developed and engaged park space. So we have a tot lot, we have a children's playground, so they're close together, so you know they can be used by the same family. We've got the community garden, and again, the grading around these areas and the planting makes it feel as though you're in a space that's not surrounded by significant vehicular travel movements. If we go to the eastern side, again, we have the dog park / open green space pedestrian walkway system, and then connections down to the Merrimack River. So in terms of a landscape, this is obviously the preferred option, and that's what came out from all the meetings we attended. And when we presented this one, the local neighborhood were pretty excited about this option, because it also serves as a great gateway into the city as well. And if you go to the next slide, there's a.
We got a question.
Sorry.
Alderman McCarthy has a question. Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, I understand that we don't want to put parking in specifically for the open space, but my question would be, where does Park and Rec put a truck when they're doing maintenance?
I can answer that. So, it would be off of East Street. It has to be adjacent to East Street. East Street does have on-street parking right now. The city could, if we wanted to increase parking, we could go to angled parking on East Street to more or less double the number of parking spaces. At that point, we did reach out to New Hampshire DOT to see if an improvement like that would be eligible under our project, the funding, and they said, unfortunately, no. So parking improvements on East Street, that would be something that the city would have to fund. But we could definitely
I'm just
increase it.
thinking if we could, so the access road that goes down to the pump house, for example, on the east parcel, if there were enough space on there for park and rec to, to park there when they're working on it, I think that would be superior to having them trying to park reasonable sized pieces of equipment on D Street.
Yeah, certainly Parks and Rec could use the pump house driveway. Yep.
I just when we do it, I'd like to make sure that we, put a way for them to use that and turn around.
And if I may follow up on the amenities with the toddler park and everything, I know this is going to be added to the cost, but do you recommend fencing and everything where it's a heavily trafficked area so that we can keep the safety of our children in there?
So the
into
community gardens and
Right.
the tot lot and the playground would be fenced in.
Okay.
And I just want to point out that the total build cost approximately for this is $721,000. And then you'll see another rendering.
Alderman Malaysia Goja?
Yes, I just have a question. The piece where the top, the community gardens will be, so on the west side, the west
Yep.
parcel, how does that compare in size to what's there currently?
So on the decision matrix here, there's a row for aesthetics and then green space. And we have summarized the size of each piece of green space that's there now. So right now, there's that triangle that's adjacent to East Street is 0.8 acres.
Okay.
When we square this off, it becomes 1 acre
Okay,
of green space. So it's fairly good size.
okay. And,
Follow up? Yes.
yes, I'm sorry, thank you. What does the slope of that look like compared to what's there now? Because now it kind of comes down a little and dips down. So is this all going to be raised? Is it going to be more level with the street? What are we envisioning there?
Jonathan Law again. We haven't got into that much detail, but I would probably think we would grade it somewhat flat, with the exception of the sides of those areas that we would berm up, like I spoke about earlier, to help screen traffic. Obviously, the playground and the community gardens need to be fairly flat, but we could have some topography or some grading in the open lawn areas, but the majority of it would be flat.
Okay.
Okay, Alderman Karen?
Yes, thank you. Could you just repeat what the city's cost would be to upgrade that
Approximately-
particularly playground area is what we want to make sure.
The cost for the whole thing is approximately $720,000. We are carrying an allowance for the playground of $200,000. The tot lot is $50,000 allowance, and the community garden is $80,000.
So the rest is ours. The rest of the city would have to pick up that cost, right?
For this, to build this entire thing, the cost would be $720,000. But if you just wanted to do those specific items, then it would be 200, 50, and 80.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, when we first looked at the existing conditions and you mentioned green space, I sort of snickered because it's more brown space than anything. And I mean, the question that brings up is, if we landscape that, does it need irrigation as well, or do we think it can actually sustain itself? Because
So,
it doesn't seem to now.
Jonathan Law again. So with any landscape that you design, there's always going to be additional maintenance, okay? And the city understand that from the conversations we've had. For a lawn area to succeed at its best level, generally it needs some kind of irrigation. So you're correct in that assumption. However, the planted areas, so the shrubs and trees, we can choose species that are native or drought tolerant. So once they become established, they won't need any additional irrigation. So for lawn areas, probably yes, some irrigation and some additional treatment so it doesn't turn into a bed of weeds. But in terms of all the other spaces that are landscape, I don't think we would need irrigation.
Alderman Dowd.
Two things. First, if we do irrigation, is there any chance, since we have a river right there, to use water from the river?
No.
No,
Too bad.
the dike is heavily regulated.
Yeah.
Going through that,
The
I don't know if it's an
withdrawal
act of
permit would
Congress,
cost us
but pretty
more than the
close.
project.
So, again, being in a proximity to the river, any chance of digging a well?
Yeah, we could look at that. We haven't yet.
Okay, so my original question was, I see we have some kind of a monument saying you're coming into the city. Years ago, on Daniel Webster Highway South, there used to be gates, because this is the gate city. But none of our other major accesses to Nashua have any kind of indication like that. So if we're gonna put something there, I would hope it would reflect the gate city, like a gate. But I don't know how much the expense is, but unless we're gonna do something at the other major intersections, I'm not sure there's a point to putting it in.
So I guess in answer to that question, the gateway element, i.e. a structure, was the least, I don't know if preferred's the right word, but it was the one thing that people weren't too concerned about or overly enthusiastic about including. So we're, as someone mentioned earlier, we're saying that this whole site is the gateway. You don't really specifically need a structure or an element. What you're creating here could be seen as the gateway into the city.
Okay.
Alderman Malaysia Goja.
Yes, I just want to make a comment to that. As I look at this, and I'm sure a few other people sitting around the horseshoe, as they look at it, I would see incorporating some sculptures from our sculpture symposium into this and kind of extending, this is who we are in Nashua, and this is part of our branding, our signature, whatever. And so I would see maybe a couple of sculptures ending up there eventually.
There's plenty of space for public art, for sure.
And if I may additional comment, I know exactly what Alderman Dowd is talking about, the city of Manchester, and my past being on the Great American Downtown, we did look at identifying with some form of archway or gate, but I think that could be done perhaps at a later time, and nobody's come up with the name of this wonderful facility, which could be Gateway Park too, so.
So just one thing I
you
want
know.
to point out is that the beauty of these two spaces is that they could be phased, so you could do the western side first and leave the eastern side as just a green lawn area and do that at a different time. We gave this cost to do everything at once, but you don't have to do that.
Good point. Alderman Lopez.
Just because everyone else is getting their bid on amenities, I want to suggest a public piano and maybe 3 dozen green bicycles.
Yeah.
All set, yep.
And this is just, and that was just a rendering of the option.
So we heard some positive feedback on alternative 3. A lot of people in attendance really liked the green space had been maximized. Even though we were adding a signal, they felt the layout was familiar to people. There wouldn't be a lot of confusion with the change. One of the cons that was noted is there would be delay for some of the vehicles moving through the intersection. just going to briefly go through these slides. We did a quick survey at the end of our public meeting, try to give us a sense of who was in the room, and there were some design elements that we're going to need some direction on later on. So we did ask some questions here. The numbers in parentheses are actually people that responded to our online survey, and the other numbers are the results of the poll we took that night. So just some results about when we asked a question about walking or bicycling through the project area. Pretty good mix there. Best location to the green space. Heavy preference for putting it next to the river. Not much preference for in the middle. The mention of a path down to the river was mentioned earlier on. A lot of support for that. Somehow having a defined way to get from the East Hollis Bridge Street area down to the top of the levee.
Yeah. I don't see how that could be feasible because of the topography again. Isn't that a good 30-foot stone drop?
We did
Because
look at
that used to, well, it was built as a levee due to the results of the 1936 flooding.
So we have looked at the grading, and we can fit a path that starts more or less across from the driveway to the pump house, and is about 5% grade. So it's people on wheelchairs would be able to use it and can get down to the levee in that distance.
Okay, so I was concerned going from the levee down to the riverfront.
Yeah,
which
it can be
would-
deceiving because when you're
Right.
at the top of the levee and you're looking to the top of the bridge, it's quite a big distance.
Right.
But the road, Ferry Street's actually coming back down, so as long as we start our path farther back, it's actually not that much grade difference to the levee.
Alderman Jettie.
So, rather than incurring a lot of expense trying to provide access to the river from this location, why can't we take advantage of, to the south, adjacent to the river to the south, there's a roadway with a kind of a roundabout looking thing that's already there. There's more access to parking. It would seem to be easier to provide access to that levee from there than it would to try to combine it with this project. Yeah, right there.
Yep. So one part of the answer to that question is this project wouldn't be able to fund that improvement. So because of our funding source, we're pretty tied into staying within more or less the right of way that we have right now. So if we start going and having our path down another street, say down here, that would probably become something the city would have to fund itself. And honestly, when we heard from the neighborhood, I'm sure right now it's probably pretty easy to get over that way, but everybody sees it as a barrier. So I think, people kind of see this as the area to get to, and then from there get to the river. And I guess I'm not sure, it never came up during the public meetings about going down a side road to get to the river. It is something we can look at as we move forward, though.
Yeah, and if I may, if you look where the Merrimack River with the arrow, again, that's the stone for that levee, and that's non-really navigable for most people. That levee's quite high. But there is an access point, and I'm probably looking over at Alderman McCarthy because the private rowing club does have a river access at,
that's what
just a little bit farther down from that.
I was looking because I don't think we own any of the property down there, so I
Yeah.
don't know that we can use it for access.
Alderman Jettie.
If I could follow up, I don't think they were anticipating, when they talking about providing access to the river, then they're not talking about the river, they're talking about the levee, that little path that's on the top of the levee.
Yes.
I don't think anybody's anticipating climbing down the levee into the water.
No. No, it
Drive
was
your
just
Chevy to the
getting,
levee, but not the river.
yeah, top of the levee to kind of enjoy the view of the river.
And would that be the good old boys on the top of the levee? Alderman Melissa Goja.
Yes, so if you could go
Go back.
back. Yeah, oh, all right, that one's fine too. On where the purple line is on the south side of Ferry Street. So like right there parallel to it is where you're looking at the path going down to the levee, to the path at the levee? No, going Ferry Street, yes. So the path is going to be
Right where
there?
my mouse was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Right
green-
there?
That green space between the purple, which would be the sidewalk at the Ferry Street level.
Right.
Between that sidewalk and what exists now as Crown Street, that's where the path would go in that grass
Okay,
area.
so so the purple's going to be the sidewalk,
Yes.
correct? Could that path be moved to the north side of Ferry Street?
It could.
And I'm only thinking that you're going to be putting this green space in and people will be there. And then they wouldn't be crossing traffic?
So yeah, if you look at the scenario before a Crown Street extension is built, providing the path
Oh,
down
right.
down the middle would require people crossing our kind of 5 lanes of traffic that connects the 2 signals.
Well, I wasn't thinking about the path there. I was just thinking on the other side of the street, on the other side of Ferry Street. But there's also the driveway into the pump station.
And we are showing a path there as well. That's what that other purple line going down is.
Right, but not down to the levee.
Not down to the levee right now.
Right.
That can be something we look into further, is maybe combining those 2 into a single path.
Because I mean, I think your thought and my thought are the same. How many lanes of traffic are people crossing to access this?
Right. Okay. Back to our survey results here. It was a pretty exciting survey because everyone had like a clicker, like they're on Jeopardy, and they clicked and it was instant results. So it's pretty fun. We did ask about what style of lighting. At the meeting, they're split evenly between modern fixtures versus something that looked historic. Online results lean more towards the traditional or historic feel. Again, for benches, pretty even at the meeting. All of the online people wanted historic. Getting to some of the gateway discussion we just had. Again, we talked about a big structure, just using lighting, having sculptures as the gateway, and then just using trees or other landscaping to announce the arrival to the city. And it's a pretty good majority for the trees. I think one of the good things that we noted at our meeting again was an over the roadway structure like that can run you $100,000 pretty easily. So saving that amount of money is definitely a plus. Just to inform, this question was asked really to inform the city about, as part of this project, do they want to do anything, any of the amenities or any of the amenities in the future, what the community was thinking. Again, pretty evenly split. I mean, playground and community garden saw more support than a dog park or splash pad. We did ask the question about should the signal at D Street be retained. The reason we asked that is alternatives 2 and 3, we don't actually need it. But one of the things we did hear from the public through this process was some people on D Street kind of like it. Even, not just to access Riverfront Landing, but just it gives them a chance to get out onto Bridge Street and make the left and have their own dedicated phase. So we asked the question, should it be retained? A lot of people didn't care, didn't have an opinion, and the majority of the yes/no was more towards the yes to keep it there. So it's just something to think about as we move into final design about whether or not we get rid of that signal. As for people at our meeting and online were coming from, majority from Nashville, but we did get some interest from some other municipalities. What types of users were at the meeting, whether residents, commuters, or just there to recreate. Okay. So just in building our, what we call our decision matrix, which is this, try to have a single way to measure and compare each. We were comparing, again, mobility, access, how that access would affect land use, obviously impacts to traffic, aesthetics, what amenities the neighborhood would benefit from each alternative, and obviously cost. And try to give them a green as being favorable, red as being not favorable. So as you look through the decision matrix, you'll see, alternative 2 and 3 really check a lot of the boxes in terms of mobility, access, and aesthetics. But you don't see an alternative that solves every traffic issue. That would require, to get green through those areas would require maybe constructing another bridge across the river somewhere to get traffic to go elsewhere, or doing some sort of bridge over another road scenario, something that was outside the scope of what we could accomplish with the funding we had.
Excuse me, Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, just looking at the matrix, the only thing that looks to be an issue is basically the PM peak traffic to Hudson. I guess what I don't, and presumably you can only do a study of what happens at this intersection with projected volumes based on what's happening today.
Mm-hmm.
If that bridge gets to be an F at PM peak, I suspect that more people will start using the one in the south and taking alternative routes to get home. Plus, there is ultimately the alternative of another bridge getting built somewhere.
Right.
I don't, and I assume if that's north of Nashua that would relieve the problem, because people coming from the south probably use the South Bridge already, so we can assume that most of the eastbound PM traffic came from the turnpike north of Nashua. So I guess it seems to me from just looking at it that alternative 3 makes the most sense. Particularly, alternative 2 makes the most sense from the traffic perspective at that intersection, but it doesn't seem to be very popular with the people who live there or use it. And I mean, the conditions are better in alternative 3 than they are in either do nothing or alternative 1. So that would seem to be the obvious choice, as I think is the conclusion you've reached.
Yes. So as we discussed this with the steering committee and coming up with a preferred alternative, one thing that was discussed was this traffic analysis is just at this intersection. The people traveling through this area are experiencing delay both in Nashua through the signals on Bridge Street or East Hollis Street, and coming in and out of Nashua and their 3 signals. So there's already delay. We analyzed Alds and Arlington when we were part of the Park and Ride project. We looked at the traffic there. We're aware of the traffic study in Hudson. I mean, there are Fs occurring in the corridor now. I think what we've done in our analysis is to make sure that this intersection is not the pinch point. What's controlling flow through this area is really the signals in Hudson. There's a lot more movements, a lot more traffic happening there. And, regardless of which alternative is chosen, I mean, that's still going to be what the Hudson signals are still going to be the signals that control the amount of traffic that get through this area. It does show that the traffic that's on East Hollis headed to Hudson, where now they don't experience any delay at this intersection, they would experience some when we introduce a light. But again, they've already just come through 4 lights coming out of Nashua heading to Hudson, and they're going to experience another 1, 2, or maybe even 3 heading into Hudson. So, when that was discussed and brought to our attention, it's like, okay, I mean, it puts some of this traffic analysis into perspective when you look at the whole corridor. So, as we discussed it with the steering committee, just due to lack of public support, the green space being isolated to the center, alternative 2 was quickly dismissed. And it really came down to alternatives 1 versus alternative 3. And that discussion is, do you want to, how the traffic operates now, and that the way the current setup is, it limits future access to the Crown Street area, and it limits access to Riverfront Landing. It requires cut-through traffic through D Street for that development to get traffic to it. So you're weighing, some decrease in levels of service for some movements against, that access, and that's how 1 and 3 were compared. When the vote was taken, it was unanimous that the steering committee recommended alternative 3 as a preferred alternative. And again, it really, even though they recognize there will be more delay for some of the movements, the benefits of the aesthetics, the green space, and the access outweighed that aspect. And improve safety. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring this up and maybe get your thought on it, but I think it reaffirms my liking of this plan. It occurred to me one day when I was looking at this on like Google Earth, where you can back out a little bit and see the whole thing. The majority of the problem we have here is we have two-lane one-way bridges, and the traffic that's coming off of them needs to cross, which is the whole problem with the conflicts there. If in fact the 2 bridges were both two-way, there would be no problem on our side of the river essentially in getting the traffic to where it wants to be, because you'd come across the South Bridge if you wanted East Hollis Street and the North Bridge if you wanted Bridge Street. So it seems like in Hudson, there may be a better solution, because ultimately they have to fix that mess anyway. And if you get the traffic to the right place on that side of the bridge, that maybe all of this goes away. And I guess alternative 3 has the best support for that, were that ever come to pass, to just change the bridge locations around. We might find we had a few lanes of pavement we don't need anymore, but I don't think there's anything that goes wrong. So I think I like this, and I'm wondering, I've discussed that with the director of NRPC, but I haven't talked to anybody on this project. So I guess I'd ask for some feedback on, is there a Hudson side solution that really solves the problem, and how does that interact with what we're doing here?
I'm an engineer, so I like to think there's a solution to every problem. So I'm sure there's something that could be done in Hudson. I'm not sure what that is. And I don't know that making both bridges, 1 lane in each direction would help. There are a lot of people going through this, going a lot of different directions. So again, that's not something I can really offer at this time. Sorry.
Alderman
Dowd was
Alderman
first.
Dowd. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I like alternative 3 as well. A little concern with traffic in the morning and in the rush hour. In the rush hour, you have several thousand people working at BAE that are going in only one of 2 directions. And a lot of them come across down Bridge Street and across the highway. And that's a problem. In the morning, they're coming the other way, but not quite all at the same time. If we go with alternative 3, I think we need to look at Bridge Street all the way to Main Street to improve that traffic flow, because I don't think it's optimal right now, and certainly the lights aren't coordinated. So I would hope that if we do alternative 3, that at least that portion of it is taken care of by the city.
Alderman Malaysia Goza.
Yes, I just have a question. We have a hope, and I may have missed this, so I'm going to apologize first if I did. We have a hope that in the future we will have a train station there. What do we anticipate the increased volume of traffic from that station coming and going will do to traffic here?
So I don't know that number off the top of my head. I do know that when we analyzed the intersections, one of the scenarios we did look at was a build out of the Crown Street area.
Right, I remember you
So,
said that.
You know, when we're looking at this scenario, we want to make sure that, you know, we're accounting for traffic that could potentially come out of this road. So that not only talked about the train station, but even just some, you know, underutilized land that could develop into something,
Right.
you know, more robust. So we worked with the regional planning commission on that. We worked with the city to gain an understanding. So I want to say there's a few hundred cars coming out of that road during the peak hour. And again, you know, there's still other ways to get out of Crown Street. And if you're making, you know, if you're heading out west on East Hollis, you know, I don't know that you're going to come down here to do that. You probably use Alds or Arlington as you do today. This is really for traffic that's, you know, getting into the area. It's certainly going to make it easier coming from Hudson and getting back to Hudson. So there could be, you know, I think our model shows a lot of just right turns coming out of that, and then people trying to get to Bridge Street from the train station.
Okay, let's see, Alderman Carroll is next, and then Alderman Jettie.
Oh, thank you. Well, as a member of the steering committee and not a traffic person, but the group as a whole really took into consideration the needs of the neighbors, as well as the fact that you have this huge development of apartment houses and some of the safety concerns that we were looking at, because there will be students going to Dr. Chris' school. So how would they walk? So they really included a lot of safety features for pedestrians as well as bike traffic. And the other thing is the neighborhood wanting some kind of green space that they could utilize. And so, you know, all the models, you know, there are some costs to the city, and we just have to decide how much we want to do and how to do it. But I think that as a group, the consensus was this alternative 3 was the best way to go. Yeah, granted, you have an extra light or what have you, but you've got to think about the future. As was mentioned, Crown Street could be built up. There's that area down in the bottom. My understanding is someone has bought that building, so we don't know what's going to happen down the lane. So for myself and the feelings that I got from people, this was the best way to go. And we did talk about going further down East Hollis Street, because I think we talked about the parking on both sides, but that is not part of the funding. So we have to work within the scope that we have and utilize that money the best way that we can. But I applaud the work, because there was a lot of give and take and back and forth. And I know, matter of fact, as of today, someone asked if we were getting a rotary here, and I said, absolutely not. So this is really, I think this is the best way to go. And I thank you for inviting me to sit on this committee.
Alderman Jettie.
So I know this is not part of the scope of your project, but you're here, and I thought I would take advantage of your presence to get your opinion. A lot of that traffic is going to BAE on Canal Street. And BAE on Canal Street has a parking problem. And the city transit recently made an arrangement with BAE the BAE is renting parking spots at the Park and Ride where the potential train station may be built. And with the idea that people from BAE would park there, and there's a bus that runs from there over to BAE and downtown, and, you know, so the BAE people can use the parking garages downtown, and, or the Park and Ride. And, you know, hopefully that will be successful. But I couldn't help think of, you know, what would be, you know, the effect. I can't help but think that it would help the bridge situation, and I don't know where they would put this, but if Hudson built a Park and Ride, and I know that the city bus system would be happy to provide a bus to pick people up in Hudson, bring them across the bridge to BAE, I can't help but think that that would alleviate some of the congestion. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on whether it would have an important impact or a little impact.
Sure. So, yeah, park and ride anywhere helps traffic. And yeah, anywhere where you can congregate it prior to a pinch point like this could be beneficial to the traffic. I'm not aware of what percentage of the peak hour traffic is associated with BAE to say it would drop, 5% or 10%. Typically, you don't see a huge drop when you do just a park and ride, just because even a large parking lot like the park and ride we have is 250 spaces. So that would be 250 trips you could potentially reduce down to, one person drives each car and 4 people leave in one car. You're reducing 160 or 170 trips. The amount of traffic going through this intersection now is in the couple thousand range. So it takes a small dent, but not a significant where you'd see no delay through the intersection. Touching on the transit aspect a little bit, one of the other advantages of this is it would help facilitate some easier movements for the buses right now. I know their routes don't come down as far as this area, just because once you get down here, it's tough to get back without actually going into Hudson and using that to get around. So they are pretty excited about having this link here where they could have a route that comes down East Hollis, swings into the park and ride, gets back on East Hollis, and then uses this road to head back on Bridge Street. So that would make things a lot easier for them.
Thank you.
Alderman Gedge.
Just hypothetical cost and time and speed and lights. If the Riverside landing was cut off, in other words, was an alternative to get in and to get out of there, what would the hypothetical, could you see savings and time and money and traffic?
I just want to make sure I understand. So if Riverside Landing wasn't there, what would the project?
I didn't say that. I said if there was an alternative.
If there was another way.
Because that is coming across the highway, it's really busy. That at the present time, there'd probably be no more than 100 cars coming out or going in there, but not all at once. But if you got a major traffic coming over, you needed a light to stop for them to get out. Mm-hmm. If you were to have 15 to 20 cars at a time and 100 waiting, do you follow? See what I mean, time-wise,
yeah,
gas-wise?
If they had another way, I mean, no, I'd have to go back and look at the actual delay and cost of travel and things like that.
Because I know that it's not certainly in the budget, but if you take a look at that white square type building, I don't know if it's for sale, etc. But we own that, you can see there's a roadway that you're going to be building into it anyway, going in there. And if the city owned that, look at that for size for a park or for gardening, et cetera. But putting that aside, the cost of that light, putting that all in there, and the time for the traffic and gasoline, et cetera. I mean, it's nothing is easy here. I'm just
That's
trying to look at something to speed the process up. Because if you own that, you could come out and go down D Street or get into it from D Street, or if you wanted to get to Hudson or you wanted to get to almost anywhere. This almost looks kind of too easy. This looks very complicated. When you get right here, it's right in the midst of everything.
Well, I would say one thing we heard and we were trying to do is make sure we weren't relying on D Street to make any movements. So we didn't want to, the residents on D Street were pretty clear that they don't like the cut through traffic they're experiencing now.
Right. Alderman McCarthy.
I would point out this is like a 5-year-old aerial, and that the skateboard park that's on the aerial isn't there anymore. There's 200 and some odd units of apartments around a road that connects to that intersection.
That's correct.
This is attaches to the plan that we have already implemented to the north. You can't go back and make it come out at D Street because they've already built it.
That's correct. Yeah, this area right here is, the buildings are being occupied right now.
Alderman Malaysia Goja.
Yeah, and I would just follow up and support, at that first meeting, the residents of both D and East Streets were very clear that they wanted to maintain their neighborhood and their sense of community there. And actually, when I look at these raised medians, I think that nicely does that. So people aren't crossing through and using those streets for cut-through streets.
Okay, seeing any further questions? Mr. Coburn, you got more on the presentation?
Just checking. I don't think so. Yep, just put up the website again if you want to see any of the documents we've produced through the study. What we're really looking for tonight is just consensus that the governing body of the city supports the preferred alternative that's been defined.
And if I may chime in, I think that intersection currently needs to be definitely addressed. I compliment you and your crew to look at the 3 viable solutions. And I've heard some comments leading to number 3, and I think I shared that thought and look forward. I particularly like the potential of the green space area, which is always good for a city of our size. That's definitely needed, and I'm glad that was included in as well. Any other additional comments from any other member of the board? Again, seeing none, I would like to personally thank you for your presentation to come before us this evening. Thank you. We're going to have a public comment period, so I'll allow you to make a statement if they would like to stay, but generally we don't open up questions to the public on the particular matter. All right, we're going to go into public comment. Mr. Cutter. Mr. Cutter, thank you for waiting.
I'm Jim Cutter at 86 Palm Street here in the city. And there's a letter of mine to Alderman O'Brien. On May 13th, 1971, Jim Gibbleson was approved for a building permit that did not comply with the Flats Ordinance NRO Section 36 that demanded actual dimensions for the lot to be built on. At the bottom of the other side of the building permit application is, quote, applicants are advised that making of a false statement on this form is a criminal offense See RSA 638:3. Tampering with public or private records. The Gilbertsons are guilty of a misdemeanor. It is very serious because it carries a penalty of jail time. Now we are looking forward to the removal of the Gilbertson fence and tin shed that have been obstructing our driveway. Maria is retired from 23 years in the city clerk office, and I am a United States Air Force veteran who, after all these years from 2005, hopes you will believe in us. Sincerely, Jim. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Cutter. At this time, do you want to come up and make a public comment? That is allowable, please.
My name is Peter Schaefer. I live on 15 E Street. If you saw that map before, 15 E Street is right there where that development we're talking about, the lights and everything. The reason, well, and I was part of the committee as well. So, and as you heard before, is that it was a unanimous vote for number 3. And the main reason was when I wanted to get you to sort of to see what we were thinking down, and the people that live down there, what we were thinking is, we looked at number 1 and number 3. Nobody could figure out number 2. So we looked at number 1 and number 3 because they both made sense to us, because what we have now works. The thing though is that this area is a mixed industrial development area, okay? And that Alphabet Street, that's all, people living there, that's all sort of residential. There are residential clusters in that area. That whole area is going to get redeveloped over the years, okay? Industrial is no longer working, okay? What's left is leaving. There are a lot of places down there that are already, being sold up for sale, and they're large lots, and you're going to get a lot of, development down there. That's probably going to be apartments and those kind of things. So I think you need that street going down to Crown Street. You're going to need something there to help develop that area. And it's actually a very beautiful area if you develop it. Just had a few little comments that some people made is that, yeah, that's an old map. And the other thing you have to consider is that it's not just the Riverside apartments that are there. There's a person that owns most of that property on that side of the river, and he's got several big buildings there, which has other traffic going, and largely trucks as well, and things like that. So you have to consider that you have to be able to get in and out of there. It's not just the apartments there. And someday that's probably going to get all redeveloped pretty thickly, okay? Now, the city owned the property where the apartments are now, and they also own a property just a little bit off that map that's also getting redeveloped that the city is selling to a developer there. There's a ball field there that we're going to lose. We already lost the skate park. So one of the reasons, and the other thing was, when it was open like that, is you could easily get to the river. Whereas now, as things get developed, you got to go figure out how do you get to the river. So we've been asking everybody is, can we get to the river after you build this? So we kind of felt we've been getting shortchanged that's why we had the discussion about, where can you put a tot lot and things like that, because we actually don't have any place to put it. So this is being worked on, so we thought, it's not the most convenient place because there's a lot of traffic in that area, but it's the only place we could think of for the time being. And the city is getting a lot more tax revenue out of these buildings that are being developed. So I think some of it should go back and help the community because it's kind of suffering because everything's being developed around it. So I do think that number 3 is the best alternative there is. There is no, you can't fix the traffic. So basically I just want to give you sort of our sense. The other question you had about the water, interestingly enough, in front of my house, that's all grass. It's never been watered and it's still green. I don't know how it does that. But all of the trees we have in that area, none of them need water. I mean, we have humongous trees down there. What happens is that area goes 30 feet down to the groundwater, and it's all sand. And certain types of trees, apparently, can deal with that just fine. The idea of having a pump there would work actually really well because after you go 30 feet down, you got as much water as you want. So I just want to make a few comments to some of the comments you had as well. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schaefer, for your comments and for your time on the committee. Thank you. We're going to go into remarks from the alderman. Going to start over here to the chair.
Yes, I don't know if these messages got to you, but I just want it noted for the record that Alderman Laws is not feeling well, which is why he was not here this evening. And Alderman Tenza had a conflict come up, and so that is why he is not present at this evening's meeting. You're welcome.
Thank you, Alderman. Any other additional comments? Clerk's fine?
We're fine.
Okay, seeing none. Alderman Gidge, do you have a motion?
Yes, let's go home, retire.
Okay, a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, none. We are adjourned at 8:51.